Jimmy Hoffa was not an easy person to get. He was a loving dad and a great labor leader who helped thousands of workers with his organizing and activism. But he was also deeply entangled with the mafia and stole millions of dollars from those same workers he was helping. And his disappearance in the 1970s has been one of the great unsolved mysteries in American history. Let's get into it. Hi folks, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Delaney. I'm a true crime writer and all-around murder nerd. And on this channel, I like to talk about some of the worst cases, and I tend to cuss a lot. So if you're into that sort of thing, go ahead and subscribe. If not, that's cool. You do you. Anyway, for Labor Day, I wanted to cover a case that has a connection to the labor movement, but not in an entirely good way. And it's a pretty convoluted case with a lot of different players, including not one, but two presidents of the United States. So buckle up, buttercups. Also, I wore a shirt I thought would be appropriate for this case. So if you're over the age of like 40 and haven't lived under a rock your whole life, you've probably heard of Jimmy Hoffa and the fact that he's never been found. It was kind of like a viral meme before the internet even existed.
Look, all we've got to do is get some cement blocks, chain him to his feet, and pitch him off the end of the pier. No one will ever know.
You are crazy. They'll find it. They always find it.
Oh, crazy am I? They never found Jimmy Hoffa.
They're gonna bury you right next to Jimmy Hoffa.
I think I found where they hid Jimmy Hoffa.
Yeah, Riddle was his middle name. Literally, his name was James Riddle Hoffa. You can't make this shit up. He was born on Valentine's Day, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana, one of four children of a coal miner and a stay-at-home mom. Hoffa's dad died when he was only 7, so his mom moved the family to Detroit. Things were hard enough for a single mom of 4 in those days, but when the Depression hit, things got even worse, as you can imagine. So Hoffa dropped out of school to help support the family. And here's where the two paths of his life started. His situation then might be familiar nowadays. He worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet. So he turned to crime. He joined a gang called the Fur Bandits, who would burglarize high-end stores and steal, you guessed it, fur coats. As you can guess, these kinds of luxury items weren't exactly the kind of thing you could just sell off the back of the truck. So the gang would fence them to the mob, which was the start of Hoffa's long connection to organized crime. But back to his honest work. One of his jobs was as a dock worker at a produce market. It was hard physical labor and it didn't pay shit. So 18-year-old Hoffa led a walkout for better pay and working conditions. And they won. And this set Hoffa down the second major path in his life, labor organizing. Within a year, he was organizing for the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, which is a truck drivers union. But this was the 1930s, when business owners would hire armed thugs and off-duty cops, who, along with the regular on-duty cops, would intimidate, beat, and arrest anyone trying to organize a union and break strikes by any means necessary. See the Haymarket Square Massacre or the Ludlow Massacre, or basically any labor movement massacre in the past century. Hoffa would dedicate the rest of his life to labor organizing, and he would even brag about all the scars he'd gotten from it. He even met his wife, Josephine, on a picket line. They would go on to have 2 kids together. After FDR passed the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, employees now had the right by law to organize and join unions. So the power of unions, including the Teamsters, really took off. By 1939, the Teamsters had grown to 420,000 members in chapters all across the U.S., mostly thanks to Hoffa's organizing. In 1946, Hoffa was elected president of the Detroit local chapter, Local 299, despite never having worked as a truck driver. And here's where the two tracks of Hoffa's life first came back together. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, had also been trying to organize truckers in the Detroit area, a clear competitor to the Teamsters. So, taking a page out of the corporate playbook, Hoffa contracted with the mob to run the CIO out of Detroit, and it worked. By 1951, the Teamsters had grown to over 1 million members and was one of, if not the, most powerful union in the country. I think the last couple of years has showed us that when the trucks stop, everything stops. And at the time, the Teamsters controlled 90% of all freight transportation in the U.S. Hoffa was quickly becoming one of the most powerful men of that powerful union. And he was somehow making a lot of money. He'd opened up a shady trucking business under his wife's name and would hire people and contract with the mob to bomb and otherwise intimidate reluctant or uncooperative businesses. But he wanted more than just money. He wanted power. He'd gotten the Teamsters in the Midwest to support the union's president, David Beck, for re-election, and in exchange, Beck named Hoffa the VP of the Teamsters in 1952. So Hoffa repaid the favor by informing on Beck's many financial crimes. Beck was hauled before the McClellan Committee, which was a Senate committee investigating criminal activities in labor unions. The committee was chaired by Bobby Kennedy, and his brother John F. Kennedy was on it as well. Remember that. Anyway, at his testimony, Beck pled the fifth over 140 times. Not a good look. So at the Teamsters 1957 convention, with Beck under federal investigation, Hoffa was elected president, where he would continue to serve until 1971. Now, as president, Hoffa had access to the Teamsters' massive pension fund. And I think you know where this is going. They say the mob built Las Vegas. Well, Jimmy Hoffa financed it. Hoffa was allowing his mob associates to use the pension fund as their own ATM, with Hoffa skimming a little off the top for himself, of course. But this massive corruption and fraud didn't go unnoticed. Soon, Hoffa himself was called to testify to the McClellan Committee for over 80 charges, including bribery, racketeering, colluding with organized crime, and lots of others. JFK himself called Hoffa a, quote, dangerous influence on the American labor movement. Despite all this, the Teamsters continued to support Hoffa, and his popularity actually increased. In the end, he managed to beat all the charges. But because of this, Hoffa fucking hated the Kennedys. After JFK was elected president in 1960, he appointed his brother Bobby as Attorney General, and Bobby was on a mission to take Hoffa down. And Hoffa was on the same mission. It's been reported that Hoffa contacted mob bosses in Miami and New Orleans to put a hit on JFK. And it's not exactly tinfoil hat territory to see the possibility of mob connections to his assassination. On November 22nd, 1963, when JFK was killed, Hoffa was in a restaurant in Miami watching it on the TV. Witnesses said he stood up and cheered. Later, he refused to lower the flag at the office of the local 299. But back to Hoffa's legal troubles. For the next few years, Hoffa was constantly defending against various fraud, bribery, and conspiracy charges across the country. But he always somehow managed to beat the charges. Back in Detroit, Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department had bugged 2 of the city's biggest mob bosses, and those recordings showed that Hoffa was in deep with the mob, and had even bribed a judge to get one of them off on some charges. Meanwhile, Hoffa was doing the same thing back. He'd bugged the FBI office and the judge in charge of his case. But he couldn't outrun the long arm of the law forever. In May 1963, Hoffa was charged with jury tampering in Tennessee for trying to bribe a grand juror during one of his many previous trials. He was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. He appealed it, and while he was out on appellate bond, he stood trial in Chicago for conspiracy and mail-in wire fraud for stealing $1 million from the Teamsters pension fund. He was sentenced to another 5 years in prison. So while he was behind bars, he named his VP, Frank Fitzsimmons, as the sort of caretaker president of the Teamsters. He figured Fitzsimmons would just serve as a figurehead, and he, Hoffa, could continue to run the union from his prison cell. But Fitzsimmons had other plans. While Hoffa continued to hold the presidency, Fitzsimmons was gathering his own loyal following among the members and, more crucially, the support of the mob. I'm leaving out a lot of stuff, but skipping ahead to December 1971. At Fitzsimmons' urging, President Nixon agreed to commute Hoffa's sentence with the condition that he refrain from any labor involvement for 10 years. Now, why would Nixon do this? I'm glad you asked. For one, he thought it would be a good PR move that would get him the labor vote, with the bonus of keeping Hoffa out of power. And then there was also the secret payment of $1 million that went through Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell. So now Hoffa was out of prison, but he wasn't happy that he'd had to resign his presidency and stop being involved in the labor movement for a decade. He desperately wanted back in the game, and he knew the only way to do that was to get back in good graces with the mob. So he started meeting with the various capos and bosses, essentially campaigning for their support. He was associating with some pretty sketchy dudes, so much so that his son feared for his dad's safety. James Jr. tried to convince his dad to at least carry a gun or hire a bodyguard, but Hoffa refused. The one faction he had to rebuild his relationship with was that of Tony Provenzano, also known as Tony Pro. Tony Pro and Hoffa had once been close, but when they were in prison together, they had a fight over some money Hoffa owed him. Tony Pro had threatened Hoffa more than once, saying he'd, quote, pull his guts out. So Hoffa was now trying to mend fences with him. So on July 30th, 1975, Hoffa was supposed to meet with Tony Pro and another mob boss, Tony Giacalone, along with one of his associates, at the Maucus Red Fox restaurant. Witnesses said they saw Hoffa arrive at the restaurant and wait impatiently for about a half an hour. He then went to the payphone outside and called his wife. He waited another hour and called another friend, again pissed about being stood up. Then, witnesses say a burgundy Mercury Marquis with 3 men inside pulled up and Hoffa got in. The 4 drove off, and Hoffa was never seen again. After 24 hours, Hoffa's son reported him missing. The FBI quickly became involved in the investigation. Gee, I wonder why. Of course, the first people they questioned were the men who he was supposed to have met with. All 3 of them had rock-solid alibis. Almost too solid. Tony Pro had multiple witnesses say he was with them in New Jersey, and Tony Giacalone had been at a local health club all day, conspicuously chatting with lots of people. They all denied that there was any plan to meet with Hoffa. So investigators looked at his family and close associates, and quickly narrowed their focus to one guy, Chucky O'Brien, a young man who'd grown up with Hoffa, who Hoffa considered like a son. O'Brien's story was that he had borrowed a friend's car to run errands that day, one of which was delivering some frozen salmon to a friend. The salmon had started to thaw and had leaked blood onto the seat, so he'd had to take it and have it cleaned and detailed right afterwards. The car was a burgundy Marquis. The friend it belonged to was Tony Pro's son. And O'Brien matched the description of one of the men witnesses said were in the car that picked up Hoffa. And it's unlikely Hoffa would have gotten into a car with 3 men he didn't recognize. When investigators took a look at the car, a scent dog alerted on the back seat and the trunk. They also found some hair in the trunk that decades later would be matched to Hoffa. Now, the results of the FBI's investigation weren't known to the public until 2006, when the Detroit Free Press published the heavily redacted Hoffex Memo, which the FBI had written in 1976 to brief their national office in D.C. It showed that the FBI believed that a Pennsylvania mob boss, Russell Bufalino, had ordered a hit on Hoffa with a contract given to Tony Pro, who was probably only too happy to carry it out. You see, just before his disappearance, an investigation had shown that millions of dollars had been stolen from, guess where? The Teamsters Pension Fund. Again. The mob was scared that Hoffa would rat them out, or if he regained power in the Union, put the brakes on their cash cow. So 3 men from Tony Pro's gang, Sal and Gabe Bergoglio and Thomas Andretta, flew into the Pontiac airport just north of Detroit that day. They were picked up by a Delaware Teamsters official and driven to a safe house not far from the Red Fox. Once again, according to the FBI, O'Brien had met with Giacalone that day, right before driving to the Red Fox and picking Hoffa up. That was one of 9 contacts O'Brien had had with the mob boss in the days before Hoffa's disappearance. O'Brien to this day adamantly denies any involvement in Hoffa's disappearance. According to the FBI, the 3 men, Gabe Bergoglio, Andretta, and O'Brien, drove Hoffa to the safe house where Sal shot him 2 times in the head. But over the years, at least 2 other men have claimed they murdered Hoffa. First, Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, claimed he'd been paid $40,000 to kill him. But he's tried to take credit for a lot of murders he didn't commit, so he can't really be trusted. Meow. Sorry, I've got to get my cat. Another mobster, Frank Sheeran, also claims that he killed him. He'd been close with Hoffa for years, but said he was forced to betray his old friend or be killed himself. He says he was one of the men in the car and that he shot Hoffa. But Sheeran might also have an ulterior motive. He'd written a book about his time in the mob, but it hadn't sold very well. And he didn't mention Hoffa in that one. But when he wrote another book, this one claiming he killed Hoffa, as you might expect, it sold much better. So the question people have been asking since 1975 is, where is Jimmy Hoffa? In the 47 years since his disappearance, there have been a lot of theories. Here are just some of them. According to the Hoffex Memo, his body was driven to a mob-controlled funeral home where it was incinerated. Another similar theory was that he was disposed of in an industrial waste incinerator that the mob had access to. Some people associated with the labor organized crime have said Hoffa was actually buried not far from the house he was killed in. And this is one of the more popular theories. His body was put in the trunk of a car and taken to a smelter. Another one was that he was stuffed into a 55-gallon barrel and driven in a gateway truck to a mob-controlled landfill in New Jersey. And he's buried underneath the Renaissance Center at GM's headquarters. Another popular one is that he's buried under the 50-yard line at the old Giants Stadium. The Mythbusters actually busted this one with ground-penetrating radar, and when the stadium was demolished in 2010, no human remains were found. Obviously, if he was incinerated or smelted, his remains are long gone. But the search for his remains continues to this day. In 2004, investigators tore up the floorboards of a house in northwest Detroit. In 2006, for 2 weeks, they dug up a farm owned by Roland McMasters, a Teamsters official who was also Hoffa's main rival in the union and was at one point a prime suspect. In 2012, they dug up someone's driveway in Roseville, and the following year, a farm in Oakland owned by mob boss Tony Taco. Just last year, in 2021, they used ground-penetrating radar at an old landfill underneath the Pulaski Skyway Bridge in New Jersey. But none of these ever panned out, and no one has ever been charged with his murder. In 1982, he was declared dead. And honestly, JFK was right about him. He was a dangerous influence on the American labor movement. Because of his case, the association of unions with corruption and organized crime was firmly imprinted in the American consciousness. That association was used quite effectively to sow mistrust and outright hostility toward unions during the Reagan administration, which is a whole nother story. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance stayed in the headlines and pop culture for decades. He's been the subject of at least 1 television miniseries, 3 movies, and a shit ton of documentaries and books. I was a toddler when he disappeared, but I grew up hearing the question, where's Jimmy Hoffa? And all the various conspiracy theories about who killed him and where his body was. The phrase, with Jimmy Hoffa, was coined as a kind of shorthand for a place that can never be found. And even though the case is almost 50 years old, holy shit, I'm old, it's still inspiring web sleuths and filmmakers. Hell, just this summer when Lake Mead started drying up and exposing bodies, there were people who believed that one of them might be Jimmy Hoffa. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this ancient history lesson. Have you heard about Jimmy Hoffa? Or do you have your own theories about where he might be? Do you think his case will ever be solved? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to like, subscribe, all that. Till next time, Darklings.